What is she talking about? My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here. This is my 9th year. I can't believe it. The project's been around for 11, and like other projects and programs here, we bring together government, NGO, business, and researchers to have dialogue and to talk about, whatever our project's issue is. And the China Environment Forum is somewhat unique at the Wilson Center in that we are the only project that has, there are a couple projects that focus just on one country, like the Brazil and the Mexican institutes. But the China Environment Forum, we narrow it even further to the small, minuscule issue of environment, which, much to my amaze, I kind of knew it was coming eventually, that has become front page news around the world. And as talk of climate change is getting more intense again, I thought, gee, I think it's about time I started having some meetings that talk about climate change in China. But not just. I mean, as you saw, from the title of the meeting is Yours, Mine, Ours, China's Carbon Emissions in an Interdependent World. China is but one piece, an important piece, U.S. being the other. And today we have two climate change researchers who are going to delve into the climate emissions trends in China and explore how China's emissions might fit in with a limited global carbon emissions budget over time. Now, these two guys, one from Sussex and one from New York, they're both climate energy gurus and also specialize in China. And they have like an intimidating number of affiliations, which I'm kind of in awe of, and I am intimidated by this, that they're doing a lot of things, but it also bespeaks that their specialties are high in demand right now. So this gentleman, not only is he speaking at 9 o'clock for us here, he has another talk at 11:15 and at noon. So, just so you know that when he darts out of here at 11, we will provide his email address so you can tackle him on email afterwards. But and also, let me introduce them properly. You do have their bios, and they're posted online for web folks. Jim Watson will be talking first, and we were actually lucky enough to grab him more easily. We didn't have to bring him over from England. He's actually right now a fellow at the Harvard School, at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And just came down last night. I really appreciate that you did that. So no jet lag, at least always encouraging. He's the deputy director of the Sussex Energy Group at Sussex University in the UK, and the joint deputy leader of the Tyndall Center Climate Change and Energy Program, visiting scholar. I think you teach classes, and then you do research. I mean, obviously at your center, you're directing other people doing research, and much of it, of course, it focuses on energy. And he's going to be, as you see from his PowerPoint, talking about China's carbon emissions, so he's going to kick us off. Now, Trevor Hauser, he's the director of the energy and climate practice at the, and I should have checked to make sure I said this right, Rhodium Group? Yep. Oh, whew, did it right. Rhodium Group. It's a specialty advisory partnership based in New York that conducts economic research on complex global themes. Now, Trevor, what's cool is that in the last couple of years he's co-authored a number of publications that focus on energy, and a lot of them China, but strikingly, a lot of them have really cool titles. My favorite being China Energy, A Guide for the Perplexed. So it's kind of like a dummies paper for people that don't know about the complexity of China's energy. So we're going to try to delve into that today. And I'm going to start off with Jim. 20 minutes. The clock is ticking. Yep. And you just remain obedient audience members and listen attentively. Okay? Thank you very much.
Out of the way of the power.
Okay.
Sit over here. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, good. Well, thanks for the kind introduction, and particularly for calling me a guru. Nobody's ever done that before, so I shall remember that. So I'm going to kick off talking about some of the work we've done over the last year or so with the Tyndall Centre, which is a British partnership of universities focusing on climate change, bringing together scientists, social scientists, and engineers. So it's a multidisciplinary centre. And we've been doing work on China for quite a while, but the latest phase of work is really trying to understand the future of China's carbon emissions and how that might fit into a global limit, if you like, on carbon emissions to stabilise the climate. But I'm going to start with some work about the implications of China's carbon emissions for international trade, because it's become quite a bone of political contention. So about a year or so ago, we did some analysis to understand the extent to which that's an issue, and if it is an issue, what does it actually mean? So I'll briefly outline some energy and emissions trends in China. I'll then talk about, well, actually, whose emissions are they? Are they China's, or are they actually ours, or partly ours, in the West, so-called, Europe, Japan, and the US, of course. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of our work on analysing future emissions. On that one, I can't go into a great deal of detail because of time, but there are further papers that I can send to people if they're interested and can certainly answer questions. And then briefly some policy implications before handing over to Trevor. Recent trends, these won't be a surprise to many people, but just to summarise so that we all know where we are. So primary energy demand in China has been growing extremely rapidly, particularly since the year 2000, on a very strong upward trajectory, obviously mirroring the rapid economic growth in that country of around 10% per year. But actually energy demand's often grown more than the rate of the economic growth, which is actually quite unusual. Big drivers of that have been across different sectors for energy. Obviously the power sector is one big area of growth. So to the extent that actually the additions of power plants each year frequently surprise even the Chinese national government. They go much further than they expected. And here I've just given some numbers. So 110 gigawatts in 2006 and 90 in 2007. And just to put that into context, that's like adding the German power system in 2006 and something bigger than the British power system in 2007. So it's very large. And China's now at the extent where I think the power station capacity is about the same as that of the United States. Most of that capacity uses coal, and that's where the emissions come in. Obviously, there are also other drivers, such as growth of transport, particularly personal transport use, and that's feeding into increases in oil demand and is one of the factors behind the very high oil prices we see today. Looking into the future, the International Energy Agency projects that, and this is just one view of the future, that countries like particularly China and India, the middle-income developing countries, are going to account for a lot of the energy demand growth in the next 20-25 years, and a huge amount of the increase in coal demand, so about 80% of the increase in coal demand. So here's the result here. I've used two different measures of China's carbon emissions here, but it gives you a sense of the emissions since 1980 and really shows that very rapid increase, which mirrors the increase in energy demand since the year 2000. The black line is the official data, which is collected by an agency called CIDIAC. The red line is the Dutch Environmental Protection Agency, which seems to be first to give us the latest emissions data, but actually their most latest data for last year probably needs to be verified, actually, because it's quite speculative at the moment. But it does at least give you an indication of the trend and where it's going. And this confirms what the Dutch EPA's headline was just quite recently, which is that China is now the biggest emitter of carbon in the world. The United States is now second. But I think the important point to keep bearing in mind with those figures is that actually if you look at the emissions per person, China is well behind the United States. It's still about a quarter of the United States per person. It's much less than the EU per person, and it's much less than Russia per person. So actually when you look at it that way, China's emissions aren't actually that high at all per capita, which is perhaps arguably the best way to look at it. Another issue, I think, is not just that China is perhaps contributing to a global problem, as we are in every country in the world, but particularly the industrialized world, is that actually China faces serious climate change impacts too. So it's not just something that is a problem being contributed to, but it's something where impacts come back to China too. So there's lots of projections. Chinese research is now burgeoning in this area, looking at impacts on agriculture, on water, on rainfall, on storms, on flooding, and are expected to be quite serious. And that's now fed into actually a sense in China that actually national strategy is required to think about emissions, but also adaptation as well. So there's now a national climate change strategy and a fair bit of policy activity, certainly at the top level of government in Beijing. The focus really, and I'll return to this in a little bit, is that of policy is to really think about energy intensity, because China is a very energy intensive economy, and so that would, if it was reduced, have both effects on some dimensions of energy security by reducing demand for energy, but also have co-benefits in terms of reduced carbon emissions. So that's the bit of background, but actually who owns these emissions? Are they actually all China's and to do with China's internal dynamic, or do they have something partly to do with the way in which China interacts with the rest of the world? And here's a quote which set off our interest in this, which was from a foreign ministry spokesman, which sort of said, well, basically there's this process of globalization going on. A lot of manufacturing has moved to China. And on the one hand, you know, Western countries, whether it be the US or the EU, are saying, well, we're going to buy all these goods and services because they're cheaper when they're made in China, but on the other hand, we're going to then point the finger at China for having high emissions. And actually, these two things are linked together. Now, this picture is something that made, certainly in Britain, the national newspapers about just under a year ago. It's one of the biggest cargo ships in the world, registered in Denmark, but actually was coming across to Europe from China, as you can see, with lots and lots of crates full of goods in them. And one of the British newspapers put this on the front page with the headline, "Christmas is coming." And that basically was an interesting illustration of the idea that actually these pallets in there were full of toys, electronics, and all sorts of clothes, all sorts of products that were coming from China to Western markets. And our question then was, well, what is the impact of all of this on China's emissions? And here's our headline results. There's actually a Tyndall Centre briefing note, if you go to the website, which you can find, and actually that's been reissued very recently around the G8 meeting. So if you want to read that, it's quite short. So for those of you with not much time, it's a very quick sort of précis of our results. We used 2004 data because it was the best year and the latest year for which we could get both trade data and some reliable climate data. And we came up with the basic headline, as it says on the slide, that 23% of China's emissions in that particular year were due to goods and services which were made for export. And that's net export, so it's taking away avoided emissions by China from importing goods and services from elsewhere, as you see by the detailed figures there. Now, we identified two main reasons for this, two main drivers. One is very familiar over here, I think, which is the large and growing trade surplus between China and the rest of the world. And there I've given some figures for the last few years. So it's gone up to about $250 billion last year in 2007. So that's one driver. The second one is actually carbon intensity, because if you multiply that value by a very high carbon intensity, you get a very high figure for emissions. And here again, I've given just some indicative figures to give an idea of how much more carbon intensive overall the Chinese economy was in the year 2000. No doubt these figures have changed since then. But to give you an idea of how much more intensive it was at that time than the US. So 0.5 kilograms of CO2 per dollar of GDP in the US, 2.76 for China, so more than 5 times more in that case. So those two factors combined led to this 23% figure. And for us, the figure was interesting, and many other researchers have done other research, some of it more detailed than we had time to do, which have basically corroborated the kind of ballpark number we've got. But for us, the real interesting thing was, what does that actually mean for international climate regimes and for policy? And that's something I will return to towards the end. But certainly it does challenge this idea in international negotiations that perhaps we should always measure emissions on a national basis. To do with geography, for example, which is to say that in the UK or the United States, you just add up all the emissions within that country, and that's the emissions for that country, when actually some of the emissions for that country, arguably, are being emitted in other countries by the manufacture of goods and services that go to those countries. Another issue is that general emissions accounting on a standard measure doesn't include things like aviation internationally, it doesn't include shipping emissions internationally, because of the way in which international negotiations work. So arguably there should be perhaps a different approach. But that is quite methodologically difficult, so there's a question as to whether we should move to the new approach. As I said, I'll return to that at the end. So this just summarises the figure where China's net exports are there compared in the 2004 year with Japan, the UK, China and the US. Just checking how I'm doing for time.
Are you doing okay?
And just to illustrate that actually this isn't just a static picture, that was 2004, but it's actually a dynamic picture and it's moving. So here I've put the emissions graph you saw earlier, which is the Dutch data, which is the blue line, and you can consult the left-hand scale for that. On top of that, I've put what the China's exports are, which is the right-hand scale, the value of exports in the same period. And you can see basically that the exports have been rising at a faster rate than emissions. So it gives at least a sense. We haven't done the calculations for subsequent years, but that probably means that that effect of the amount of emissions from exports is perhaps growing in years after 2004. But before everybody gets the idea that actually, oh dear, that's going to get worse and worse, so we've really got to do something about trade or whatever and descend into protectionism perhaps, Some of our longer-term work, which I'll talk about in the second half now, maybe gives a clue as to perhaps it might change in the opposite direction, because actually in China itself, economically, this is seen as a real problem. It's not perhaps a growth model that China and the Chinese government wants to follow. So how are we analysing future emissions? I'll just talk a little bit about our method without going into great detail. What we've done is to look at what's called a carbon budget, and that isn't just looking at emissions in 1 year, it's looking at emissions over time, over 100 years in our case, between 2000 and 2100. And the reason we're doing that is going back to the science of climate change, which says that actually carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions have a very long residence time in the atmosphere. And so it doesn't actually matter, for the purposes of policy, whether a ton of carbon is emitted in 2000 or whether it's emitted in 2020, because they stay in the atmosphere for a long time. And that's why historic emissions have a big impact on climate policy and who should actually move first to do something about it. Because actually, if you look at all the emissions in the atmosphere right now, the overwhelming majority have come from industrialised countries, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4. So that's the reason why we're looking at emissions over time and not just a static picture. So there's a number of ways we could have looked at this. The ways we've chosen is to say, well, let's choose, looking at the science, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from last year, what kind of budget for the world would correspond to some sort of reasonable stabilisation target, and then see, well, can China live within its share of that budget? That's basically what we're trying to do. So we're using a cumulative emissions target. This has already been used by my colleagues for the UK, and there are papers and reports on the Tyndall website that show exactly how this has been done. And this allows us then to say, well, this is the overall budget, and then try and understand what changes in the different constituent parts of China's emissions from transport, from power sector, from industry, would actually mean that China lives within that overall budget over time. And we're actually collaborating with a number of organisations in China, in the UK, and we've done a few workshops to try and understand stakeholder views on how exactly these budgets should be turned into emissions pathways over time. So I'm going to illustrate what the carbon budget means, and I thought I'd use something which is rather topical, which is the latest G8 communique, which is only a week or so old, from the G8 meeting in Japan. Basically, they managed to finally sign up to this idea that industrialised countries, or the G8, would cut emissions by 50% by 2050. It was squeezed out of the Japanese spokesman that actually that would be compared to 1990 levels. Not a great leap forward, since all these countries agreed to the same thing in 1992, but at least it gives me a good way of illustrating this budgeting approach. So this is the goal on a chart, relative emissions up the side, and actually just to illustrate that the pathway between here and there actually matters for global climate change. And I'm just going to illustrate two idealised curves. One we might call in the UK a ski slope, if that makes sense to you. It looks a bit like a ski run. So you would go and you would reduce emissions quite quickly to start with, and then more slowly as you get to your 2050 goal. The alternative, which is what we might call the falling bullet or the cliff edge or whatever you want to call it, is that you don't actually do very much in the short to medium term, and then you rapidly scramble to try and meet your target towards the end. Now, you'll note from a cumulative emissions point of view, those two trajectories are extremely different. They meet the target, both of them, but one is a great way to do it and one is not a very good way to do it. So the ski slope is much better in terms of the cumulative emissions over that period, the area under the curve, if you remember your basic maths from school. And so that's why people were very critical of the G8 communique and saying, well, actually, what we really need is a recipe for early action in the next 10 years to show that you're actually making progress on that ski slope type trajectory, because that's what the climate actually needs you to do. So the cumulative emissions are larger. So that's the approach we've taken, and we've actually looked at different shapes for China. So the budget we've used overall is 490 gigatons of carbon. Sounds like an extremely large number. That's 490 billion tons of carbon over the 21st century for the world. This would stabilise the climate at 450 parts per million just of CO2, not of all greenhouse gases. But the important point to note is that actually even that would have quite a big chance of breaching the dangerous climate change threshold, which many people think of, which is 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise on average. So even that stringent target has a high chance of having some pretty serious impacts on the world. We've used two different approaches to deciding what China's budget would be in that. One is to allocate emissions equally per person, Another is to equal emissions per intensity of GDP across the world, and different people have different preferences. There are many other methods you could have used. We've just used this to generate some different budgets for China. Incidentally, under the first one, 70 gigatons of carbon for China. For the United States, you probably get about 60. And the reason the United States is quite high under that is because per capita emissions are so high at the moment. The method allows the US to reduce that per capita emissions over a long time period, so its budget would be quite high as well. And then what we're trying to do is connect these budgets to some medium-term pathways, because, again, it's all very well as scientists saying, well, this is a big long-term goal, but how does that actually link to where emissions are going in the short to medium term? So I'm just going to briefly show you, I think, some results, but before I do, I just want to highlight one critical thing which links this analysis to what I said about trade earlier. And for this meeting, certainly, I think it's the most sort of critical part of our emission scenarios. And this is that Chinese policy, as I said before, is really not, policymakers are not particularly happy about the growth model that China is following at the moment. The fact that it's driven very much by exports and it's driven very much by investment in energy-intensive capital stock and industries. And they actually want to shift to a pattern that's away from that energy-intensive investment towards more domestic consumption on one hand, but also to more value-added innovation, more innovative industries, and less of the old-style energy-intensive industries. And if that happens, then actually I think it's going to have a big effect on both dimensions, which are feeding into our 23% of emissions figure for traded goods, because it both feeds into the carbon intensity figure, but also feeds into the amount of exports figure. So it's interesting that China's own policy is actually wanting to move away from both of the driving factors involved in our analysis. And in our scenarios, what we're trying to do is explore to what extent that might have an effect on the way in which China's pathway might go in the future. So we're looking at different speeds of rebalancing and different extents of rebalancing. And here's, just to reinforce the point, a quote from Wen Jiabao, the Chinese premier, from earlier this year, just to reinforce that, you know, as part of speeches, it regularly comes up that actually this growth model is not something we want, and we do want to move away from polluting industry, from excess capacity, and towards a more balanced growth model. In the past, they've had mixed success in doing this shift, but certainly the will is there. So here's just a very quick illustration. This is probably something people will want to ask questions about, because I haven't time to walk you through in great detail of our scenario pathways. This is just basically the historic data. So the axis along the bottom has now been stretched out to 2100. So here's actual emissions going to, I think, around 2005. And what we've done is superimposed on this graph two medium-term pathways and then our scenarios going forward. So the first set of pathways, we've taken what we've called, on the bottom you'll see ERI Scenario B. ERI is a research institute of the National Development and Reform Commission, one of the powerful ministries in China. And at the time they did this analysis a few years ago, this was one of the ways in which they thought they might start to reduce emissions, by implementing a range of policies on energy, energy efficiency, renewables and that kind of thing. Now, because 3 years have passed since they published it, it now looks like an extremely challenging scenario. At the time they published it, it looked like a kind of business as usual with a bit of climate policy added. Now it looks very challenging indeed, because emissions are already about at the same level of the higher square, which was supposed to be for 2020. So our first set of scenarios are quite challenging, and they include within them a big shift in Chinese industry towards these less intensive industries. So that's one particular scenario. These are very stylized graphs, but basically the area under that orange curve there is 70 gigatons of carbon, which is taking the per capita approach and taking that overall carbon budget for China I spoke of earlier. So that's one possible scenario. We can change the shape of that, because at the moment it has rather a steep and quite precipitous corner at it at 2020, and you can't imagine real economies behaving like that. So this is still work in progress. Another one you could do is say, well, actually, we'll allocate a bigger budget to China and give them longer to actually adjust economy, so the economy would adjust perhaps slightly more slowly, but it would turn around, and again, you get this rather rapid decline in emissions. So that's two of our scenarios, and that's where they come from. The second pair come from a slightly higher trajectory in the short to medium term, and this one we've taken from the International Energy Agency, which is a body founded in 1973 after the oil shock to really think about oil. So it's not really known for its radicalism when it looks at carbon emissions. It's only very recently IEA started to seriously engage with climate stabilization in its sort of analysis. And this is rather typical IEA scenario, which is sort of business as usual light, you might call it, which includes business as usual projections with a bit of climate policy added. But as things have turned out, that seems to be the track that China seems to be on at the moment. So again, we've combined that with our carbon budgets. So once you start combining a higher trajectory with our carbon budgets, you start getting some rather ambitious types of trajectories. And to the extent that the smaller budget, we've had to make it bigger, because otherwise it just wouldn't have worked. And again, we'll have to, in later versions, smooth off that peak, because that's a rather frightening type of economy to look at. I guess another caveat for this is that some of these scenarios might actually be warnings as opposed to models to follow. Some of them might be, well, this is the way in which you can make short-term policy and long-term budgets commensurate with each other. Others might be, well, here's what happens if you wait too long or you emit too much in the short to medium term. And then if you combine the bigger budget, obviously there's more time to adjust. But again, you've got this very steep trajectory downwards at the end. Note that under all of our scenarios, China's emissions continue to rise for some time to come. And I think that's a really important point. Even under most of these allocation methods, there is still some headroom for developing countries, but even China, to keep increasing emissions. And I think that's really important politically, because it gets us away from this idea that China must sign up to targets now, which I think is unfair and unjust. So that's the scenarios themselves, which we can come back to if people want to. So what about policy implications, just to round off? First, on the trade part, the extent of these exported emissions certainly calls into question this traditional accounting, as I said, on national emissions. So the idea that countries' emissions are just within their borders is seriously challenged because we're in a globally traded world, a globalized world. Emissions come from all over the place, and our purchasing decisions are linked to emissions in many different countries, not just the country we happen to live in or buy goods and services in. But the alternative way of doing this, consumption-based emissions accounting, which many people have started to do some work on, a lot more detail than we did, is very fraught with difficulties. Methodologically, it's very hard to follow products all the way from the shop or the place where you buy them or install them right through to the source and actually count up all the emissions embodied within those products. It's very, very difficult to do. So it becomes contentious. But I think the best thing we perhaps could do, and this is a point made by some of the other researchers in this area, is perhaps refining the methodology and at least using consumption-based accounting as a shadow measure to give a sense of, well, to what extent these production and consumption-based accounting measures are different. And the shadow measure can also give you some clues as to what else you might do as part of your climate regime to recognize the fact that these interdependencies exist and these differences exist. I mean, for me, it certainly reinforces this need for industrialized countries to commit to bounding emissions cuts and take the lead first. Because not only are we responsible for most of historic emissions, but actually we are responsible for a certain amount of the emissions of developing countries like China now. So even those emissions have got higher, some of those are due to interdependencies. They're to do with purchasing decisions in industrialized countries. I think it's a further rationale for technology assistance and transfer, something that, although China is a middle-income country now, in some of the industries, particularly the heavy industries, their efficiency, their standards, their technology levels are way behind the state of the art. And so there is a need for that technology transfer and low-carbon finance. And certainly it's crucial to a global deal. If you listen to Chinese policymakers, they will tell you that they've been waiting for this for well over a decade now, and the Western world really hasn't made good on it. And it's only recently, with the announcement of new funds through the World Bank, that you start to see the kinds of investment funds being put on the table now, including funding from the US and the UK. And then the other thing, which I think Trevor will probably talk about a bit more than I am going to, is that perhaps sectoral approaches, looking at those industries which are exposed to international trade and think about where perhaps you might make some sort of special arrangements for them, where there are genuine competitiveness issues. But again, maybe people have different ideas about how that may be done, and there's a need for a real tangible, enforceable type of measures within those industries, and that's not an easy task. And certainly that last point, when you start thinking about trade and climate, you start getting a lot of rhetoric. I've just given you a European example for the President of the European Commission. He heads up well, the closest thing we've got to a government in Europe. It's not really a government, but it's certainly the civil service in Europe. And he sort of posited this idea in January that perhaps importers to the European Union might have to buy allowances in our emissions trading scheme. So they might have to be treated the same as industry within the EU. And that started off a huge debate about whether this was protectionism by the back door. And it's certainly fraught with difficulties. And I know certainly it's a stronger tendency, if anything, over here. So it's something I think we have to be very careful about. So final three policy implications on the future. I think the future scenarios we've done emphasize this importance of cumulative emissions. On one hand, that gives flexibility to the pathways you have, but on the other, it takes us away from this percentage reduction by a given year, which kind of gets is where a lot of these goals get reported, and often this complexity gets lost. It reinforces this early action and short to medium term policy, what was missing from the G8 communique and what hopefully will come out of the post-2012 negotiations. And the China analysis does show how challenging 450 ppm CO2 is. For some, this is too high. They prefer to see something lower. People like James Hansen would like to see it a lot lower. But it reinforces the need to adapt and mitigate, reinforces the need to act early, but it also reinforces this need for interdependency and that be fed into policy in terms of low-carbon finance and assistance to developing countries. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand on to Trevor.
Yeah. I've actually found that we've been pretty lucky in the China Environment Forum that we have, not too long ago, we actually had, from the IEA, we had Jonathan Sinton, who, kind of like you, a scientist, and he actually portrayed himself as a nerdy scientist, but that, like him, he can communicate, right? You understood all that he said. Sometimes I'm always a little dubious when you invite the scientist types. Now we have another type of scientist, social scientist, right?
I guess.
Economics is supposedly a science.
Well, the dismal scientist.
The dismal scientist. But I fancy that Trevor also is a good communicator. So. Oh, is Jim in the way? Jim, you're being kicked out.
Okay.
Helen, I like aggressive audience members. You know, you come on over here, Jim.
Thanks for asking me to join today, Jennifer, and thanks you all for coming out so early on a whatever today is, Thursday morning. I'm going to cover a number of the same things that Jim did. I agree with the point that he arrives at in the end, though I might take a couple issues with some of the ways that he gets there in the interest of spirit of good scholarly debate. But I'm going to first start with a look at what has caused that increase in Chinese emissions that Jim was talking about that we've seen over recent years, because that's important in understanding where China's going and how it's going to get there. This is my energy history of the People's Republic of China chart. This is an energy intensity chart, so it's the amount of coal, gas, and oil that's required for each unit of economic output. Right? So a rising line means that the Chinese economy is getting more energy intensive, requires more energy resources to do the same basket of goods. A falling line means it's getting less energy intensive. And there's three inflections that are important since the start of the PRC. The first is the Great Leap Forward in 1958, where Mao Zedong takes a country rich in labor and relatively poor in resources, and instead of following the economic development model taken by Japan and Korea and Taiwan, moves the country in an energy-intensive direction in pursuit of a Soviet-style ambition of heavy industrialization. So moving people off of the farm and into the steel mill. Right? The result of that is that the energy intensity of economic activity increased threefold over a 20-year period. And by 1978, there weren't enough people left on the farm to grow enough food. China was looking at another wave of famines, as it happened in the early 60s, and the government started to take a step back, and that's the beginning of the reform period that has given us the China we know today, starting in 1978. So a couple things over the past 20 years happened that are important to give us the Chinese energy profile we have right now. The first is that there was a restructuring of state-owned enterprises of the economy, so that managers of firms were given freedom to manage costs. This was happening at the same time as energy prices were being liberalized. So for the first time in China's history, you have a corporate sector that's starting to worry about energy costs and so starts looking for efficiency. There had never been an incentive to do that before. Also, we have a structural shift. As individuals and firms are given more freedom to decide what to do in the economy, China moves back towards its comparative advantage, towards the direction of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in labor-intensive manufacturing. So we see a structural shift in the economy, away from steel, cement, heavy industry, towards textiles, t-shirts, apparel, the things we know China for today. You take those two trends and you combine them, and over a 20-year period, the energy intensity of the Chinese economy is cut by 2/3, which means that by 2001, each unit of economic output in China only requires a third as much coal, gas, and oil as it did in 1978, which means that the China of 2001 was only 10% of global energy demand rather than 25% of global energy demand, which is what it would have been if none of that had ever taken place. That degree of efficiency improvement is unprecedented for either a developing or a developed country. Starting in 2001, looking forward, folks in Beijing and at the International Energy Agency in Paris and energy forecasters here in DC thought that China would have another 20 years to go of that type of improvement in efficiency. Because even in 2001, the Chinese economy was 5 times as energy intensive as major economies in the rest of the world. And instead what we saw was a reversal in that trend and an increase in the energy intensity of economic growth. This surprised everybody, and it gave us this type of projection looking forward from today. Right? So this is energy demand on an annual basis. And I do have a laser pointer, do I?
Yeah.
All right, here we are.
We're
okay. So this is red as China, just to make it easy, to harden and calcify stereotypes. The bottom line here, dotted line, is the International Energy Agency's 2002 forecast for China. Right? This is the forecast they made just 5 years later, based on 5 years of data. That's an upward revision of 79%. In 2030. So that's 2 Indias of today, or an India of 2030 is the rounding error when we think about where China's going to be in the future, right? So the question is, what happened over the past 5 years? Why did 20 years of impressive improvements in energy efficiency change suddenly? At the core is urbanization, right? China accounts for about 25% of all global urbanization. Over the past 10 years alone, about 170 million Chinese have either moved from the countryside to the city or had cities built up around them in what used to be countryside. That type of construction takes a lot of steel, aluminum, cement, glass, energy-intensive goods. But that urbanization rate has been at current trends for the past 20 years. What changed over the past 5 was the nature of that urbanization. And this corresponds with macroeconomic changes in China and a surge in investment, in fixed asset investment. So we had urbanization happening in a much more resource-intensive manner. Bigger houses, bigger highways, because capital and materials were fairly cheap relative to other inputs in the economy. Other change that's important is that in previous investment surges, like here and here, when China would go on a spending spree, it would buy from abroad all the steel and cement it needed to, not all of it, but a significant amount that it needed to do that construction. In this investment surge, the reverse happened. China not only started making for itself all of those goods, but started selling a balance onto the global market, right? And that's what's responsible for a lot of the current global trade surplus China has. This comes as a surprise to many people, but for the first 2 decades of China's reform, the country ran a fairly balanced trade on a global basis, right? Has long run a bilateral trade surplus with the U.S., but globally, China imported just about as much as it exported, right? So all the televisions and T-shirts and underwear that Chinese manufacturers sold to the U.S., they imported as much semiconductors and machinery and natural resources and ran fairly balanced trade. That starts changing significantly in 2004. But what's interesting is that the change wasn't that China started selling more T-shirts and underwear than it did before to the rest of the world. It's that it stopped importing a lot of the things that it used to buy, right? A trade surplus is exports minus imports. And so it was the slowdown in the import side that led to the growth in China's trade surplus. So here's China's trade position. So everything above the line are categories of goods China runs a trade surplus in. Everything below the line is what China runs a trade deficit in. Right? So the general pattern is deficit in machinery and chemicals in primary goods. This is the oil spike right here that we're all experiencing right now. And then on the upside of the chart would be textiles and apparel and electronics. Now the swing factor, and what's responsible for a lot of the growth in China's trade surplus, is metals. China goes from being the world's largest steel importer in 2002 to the world's largest steel exporter by 2005. Just the change in the metals trade balance is responsible for fully half of the growth in China's global trade surplus over the past few years. So we have a China today that's 50% of global glass production, 50% of global cement production, 35% of global steel production. The energy implications of this are significant. When people go to Beijing or Shanghai and you see streets packed with vehicles, lots of new office blocks, most Westerners assume that that's what China's energy challenge is, because that's what it is here in the U.S., right? It's our cars and it's our homes and it's our office buildings. That's not what drives energy demand in China. It's industry, and it's energy-intensive industry. The iron and steel sector alone in China consumes 18% of the country's energy resources. 18%. That's almost double all the households in the country combined, right? Chemicals industry uses more energy than all private transportation. All of those vehicles you see on the road in Shanghai and Beijing. The aluminum industry uses more energy than all commercial sector, right? 70% of primary energy demand in China comes from industry. The balance coming from transport, commercial, and residential. So this is where I want to chat a little bit about how we think about China's integration into the global economy, and some of the numbers that that Jim talked about in terms of what share of China's CO2 is embedded in exports. Right. This is a very difficult methodological challenge, as I'm sure Jim would be the first to acknowledge. Right. You can get a fairly good number about how much of Chinese energy demand goes into exports because there's some input-output tables that you can use. The challenge is figuring out how much is displaced by imports. And the approach that most folks have used, and the one that they use at the Tyndall Center, is looking at the carbon intensity of economic activity, right? So China's GDP is 5 times as carbon intensive as that in the U.S. or Japan. So then Chinese exports are assumed to be 5 times as carbon intensive as exports from Japan. But the reason that the Chinese GDP is 5 times as carbon intensive is not because each T-shirt or piece of underwear requires 5 times as much CO2. It's that the structure of the economy in China is very different than the structure of the economy elsewhere in the world. In China, industry accounts for 50% of GDP. And within that industry, the energy-intensive industries we're talking about here account for a very large portion, right? In the U.S., industry is 20% of GDP. Service sector is what we do here. And services don't take nearly as much energy as manufacturing does. Let me give you a concrete example. When you go to Walmart and you buy a DVD player and you pay $100, right? 60% to 70% of the value of that DVD player didn't come from China, even though it says made in China on the box, right? 60 to 70% of it came from Taiwan and South Korea and Japan in the form of semiconductors that are final assembled in China and shipped to the U.S. So even though it says made in China on the bottom and at customs it all shows up as an import from China, most of the value is non-Chinese, right? So now if we're doing this accounting and we're thinking about how would you do a carbon-based accounting on this question, if the semiconductor, the $60 of that 100 that comes into China, right? If that comes from Japan, it's at 1/5 the carbon intensity as when it's exported to the U.S., right? So if we're doing our budget, we import that $60 worth of chips, and let's say that $60 in Japanese GDP equates to 60 tons, right, of CO2. So now you take those chips into China, and a factory assembles them and ships them to the West. Now we're assessing that $100 of export at a Chinese carbon intensity of GDP that's 5 times that of Japan, right? So instead of 1-to-1, it's 5-to-1. So now we're saying that 500 tons of carbon went into that DVD player, and we subtract the 60 tons that came from Japan, and we get to a balance of 440 tons, right, as the net trade surplus. Yet the assembly of that DVD player actually didn't require that much more CO2 than if it had been done in Japan. There's some other approaches that look at if you just imported, if you counted for imports as the same carbon intensity as exports, if you assume that a DVD player made anywhere in the world is the same carbon intensity, which is not correct, but if you assume that that's true, then China is a net importer of carbon dioxide, right? If you look over the long run, China is a country that's fairly rich in labor, fairly poor in natural resources, and its comparative advantage lies in labor-intensive goods, things like underwear and T-shirts and electronics and labor-intensive services, not in steel and cement. Indeed, and as I'm going to show in a moment, most of the demand growth for those goods takes place in China for the really carbon-intensive goods, right? 90% of Chinese steel produced is still consumed domestically, despite the growth in exports to the U.S. So over the long run, what you would expect is China to be a net importer of embedded carbon right? And countries that are rich in natural resources to be net exporters of embedded carbon. So while it's tempting for policymakers in Beijing to put forward a consumption-based approach to carbon accounting based on this current surge in a trade surplus, right? Over the long run, it's possible that China would be the largest global loser from such an approach, given where they are in their industrialization, how much cement and steel they're going to need to grow over the next 20 years, and where that cement and steel is likely to be made. The other risk of this approach, and this is going to get me into my second section here, is that when you get down to the actual policy implementation of a consumption-based accounting, so let's assume for the moment that it's correct that 23% of Chinese CO2 emissions ultimately end up in the US or Europe. When you get down to how do you actually deal with that in policy, it gets into a road that Chinese policymakers probably wouldn't be so excited with, particularly trade measures. If you put that argument up on the Hill, the response you will get is exactly, right? We'd be happy to take the jobs back and deal with the CO2 emissions if you want to give them back to us. We'll take the CO2 emissions if we can have the jobs back. And if, in fact, it's true that 23% of your emissions ultimately end up in the U.S., for us to prevent that from becoming 50% of emissions when the U.S. passes climate policy, we're going to have to put sanctions on Chinese goods, right? And if it's true that China is the most carbon-intensive producer, then any policy to try to address that is going to switch consumption habits from you and me away from Chinese goods to goods produced in less carbon-intensive economies. So while it's useful rhetorically to think about how is the burden shared, when you think about actually implementing a consumption-based approach in practice, even aside from the methodological challenges, which are very large, all of the ways that you would implement that would lead to switching away from Chinese goods towards goods produced in less carbon-intensive places. All right. So this gets to the second part of the section, which is how this growth and this debate about mine, yours, ours is playing out in the U.S. Congress. And this is playing out against a backdrop of declining manufacturing employment in the U.S., both as a share of the economy and in absolute terms and in terms of employment. There's a number of reasons for why this has happened. The one that gets the most attention is international trade. And within that, China, of course, is the 800-pound gorilla in the room when we talk about the U.S. trade deficit. We have a bilateral trade deficit with China of about $200 billion, $250 billion today. And so when we talk about implementing a cap-and-trade program here in the U.S., one of the top concerns is what would it do to those energy-intensive industries that China has increased production so much of in recent years. In a book that we put out a couple months ago, we do an assessment of what those industries are, and it's industries for which energy is a significant share of the cost of goods sold, and industries that are exposed to international trade, right? So you both have to face international competition, and you have to have energy costs be significant in your operating budget, and that gives you a list somewhere like this. So this is aluminum and glass, chemicals, cement and cement. This is aluminum, copper, chemicals, cement and glass, paper and pulp, iron and steel. Refining takes a lot of energy, but it's not dealt with in the same way under climate policy. And then we have the more trade-exposed but labor-intensive manufacturing products over here that aren't as vulnerable under U.S. climate policy, right? So we deal with these 5 sectors right here, which ironically, these 5 sectors in China account for about 42% of all energy demand, and that's the energy challenge in the People's Republic. And when you look at the source of imports of those goods, while in the U.S., the focus is clearly on China. Where we import most of those goods from are either developed countries that either have already imposed climate policy or are likely to, or from developing countries that have a lower carbon intensity of production than the U.S. China is not the major exporter to the U.S. of steel and aluminum and chemicals, paper. They are in cement, but not in the other 4. Most of our steel, aluminum, and chemicals imports come from either Canada or Mexico. They come from the European Union, or they come from places like Trinidad and Tobago that have lots of cheap natural gas, right? All of those are lower carbon-intensive producers than here in the U.S. So there's a concern that if the U.S. passes climate policy, that industry will migrate to a more carbon-intensive location, and that'll undermine the effectiveness of climate policy here in the U.S. So you have a steel mill that picks up out of Pittsburgh and moves to China and emits more in China than it would have in Pittsburgh, and so then the effectiveness of your climate policy is undermined. But when you look at the league tables of where our imports come from, the growth in imports would most likely come from countries that are lower carbon intensive than current U.S. production, because those are the places that are most competitive today. In addition, measures that attempt to just address a domestic market don't address export markets and third markets. And that today is where most of the demand growth for these goods are. And this is for those 5 categories of products that I just mentioned. This is the demand growth since 1990 in steel, aluminum, chemicals, paper, and cement, broken down between Annex I countries. So those are developed countries that under the UNFCCC are required to take commitments in climate policy, and other countries, so developing countries. And as you can see, steel demand's actually declined in the rich world over the past. We're pretty built out here, and we recycle most of the steel that we use. Steel demand has grown 188% in the developing world. Cement, 186%. That's because that's the part of the world that's still urbanizing. That's where the demand growth is going to continue to be for these goods in the years to come. In addition, while China's gone from a net steel importer to a net steel exporter in recent years, the share of its exports to the U.S. are still fairly small. 90%, because of that demand growth within China, 90% of the steel that's produced within China is consumed domestically. Only 1% of it is exported to the U.S., right? So you add up all the carbon-intensive goods manufactured in China and exported together, and they account for about 0.2% of Chinese GDP. Right? So this is a critical point, that while Chinese exports of electronics and televisions are very important to the Chinese economy, exports of steel, aluminum, and cement are not very important to the Chinese economy. And as Jim mentioned, these are goods that Beijing is already trying to rein in exports of because of local energy and environmental concerns. It's not China's intention to become the world's largest steel producer and exporter. Those 5 industries that I mentioned account for 42% of Chinese energy demand. That means they account for 42% of the $200 billion worth of economic loss that comes from air pollution each year in China, right? And they're not big job creators. They only employ about 13 million people, those 5 industries combined, out of a country of 1.3 billion, right? That's less than just the service sector in Guangdong province alone. So we often talk about it being a binary trade-off in China between economic growth and environmental protection, right? But for China, it's actually not. Many of the things that China needs to do from an economic standpoint are going to deliver an environmental and a climate benefit as well. If you want to create new jobs each year to deal with the 15 million Chinese that are moving from the countryside to the city, iron and steel, cement's not the way you do it. You do it through services and labor-intensive light industry. And we already see significant policy being put in place to try to move the other way. So much so that most analysts expect China to return to being a net steel importer by 2009 and a net aluminum importer as early as the end of this year. So turning to the international side, to wrap up, Jim laid out a framework for what type of budgeting we need to do to get to stabilization. And I want to talk a little bit about the politics of how we might be able to get there. This is the way the world looks if you're sitting in Washington, D.C., right? The inset is the growth in CO2 emissions. This is similar to the chart that Jim had up through 2007. And then the main chart is the projected growth right now from the International Energy Agency of emissions between now and 2030 off a 1990 baseline, right? Dark lines to 2005, light lines to 2030. And if you're sitting in Washington, and this is what colors the debate here, it looks like even if the OECD stops doing anything, even if we close up shop and go home and stop emitting any carbon, that just emissions from the developing world will be enough to keep us above stabilization, right? But the world looks very different if you're sitting in Beijing. And what the Chinese will point out is that it's cumulative emissions that matter, and this is a point that Jim made, rather than annual emissions. CO2 stays in the atmosphere. It stays there for a long time. And so if we're thinking about the warming effect of CO2, then we have to think about the stock that's in the atmosphere. And the argument is that responsibility should be apportioned based on who put the stock in the atmosphere in the first place. And when you count up emissions over the past 150 years, China accounts for about 9% of what's there. The U.S. accounts for 29%. So that's much different than the annual numbers that people focus on here. In addition, as Jim mentioned, on a per capita basis, China is still far behind the U.S., about a fourth or a fifth per capita of what the U.S. is. So the attitude is, it's your Superfund site. you put it there, you clean it up before coming to the developing world and asking us to do the same. So this is the tension we're in, right? There's an equity challenge of who put it there and whose responsibility it is to take the first step. But there's also the very real concern of if the developed world moves and the developing world doesn't, we're not going to get to where we need to be, right? There's a notion in the that's embodied in the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol that's common but differentiated responsibilities. So all countries, developed or developing, have a responsibility to address climate change. But we have different responsibilities. And that's actually appropriate because the rich world and the poor world have common but differentiated challenges when it comes to addressing climate change that mirror the types of economies we have, right? So in the U.S., we have a consumption challenge. That's our problem. We consume too much. And most of our CO2 emissions come from the things we consume. They come from driving automobiles and from our homes and from our office buildings. They come from you and me. In China, most emissions come from industry, as I said before. They don't come from consumers. They don't come from average Chinese. And so while a Chinese negotiator going to Bali or now to Copenhagen can't possibly agree to the same type of cap as the U.S., because at 1/5 the per capita emissions, that would mean that a farmer in Guangdong province who'd struggled his whole life to buy an air conditioner wouldn't be able to turn it on, but a guy in California could drive their Hummer, right? Because we would be budgeted 5 times the carbon budget per person as China. So that's a non-starter. But the good news is it's not that farmer in Guangdong who's the source of Chinese emissions. It's industry, and it happens to be industry that Beijing's already trying to rein in. And so in there lies the possibility of an agreement that can get us another 25 or 30 years down the road. That if the rich world moves first and takes comprehensive action, economy-wide, to reduce emissions, the developing world agrees to, in the interim, discipline key internationally traded carbon-intensive industries. That, A, helps achieve other economic goals that China has, and B, it helps alleviate some of the competitiveness concerns in U.S. and Europe that are preventing us from taking action right now. And it staves off risks to that in the interest of ensuring an effective climate regime in the U.S. and Europe. We put in place trade measures and border tariffs that have other risks for the global economy. Let me stop there.
All right. Well, applaud this gentleman. And you get to come back. If there's any one slide that you guys want to post up there to refer to, or we'll keep the PowerPoint open. All right, I have Ma Tianjie and which other intern? Okay, Kimberly on the microphones. Raise your hands nice and high, and when you do take the mic, please tell us your name and affiliation so they can know where you're coming from. Okay, your job is now to ask intelligent questions. Okay, right here in the middle, Ma Tianjie.
Hi, my name is Alison Palzer, and I'm with Population Action International. I actually just had a couple of basic questions. The first is research being done by either Tyndall Center or the Rhodium Group on how to predict how climate change and carbon emissions will impact humans at all? That's kind of research I've noticed is not out there. The second question I had was, how will these reduced emissions affect China's industry, how they live their lives, especially in rural communities?
Okay. Good questions.
Do you want me to take it now?
Okay,
yeah, sure,
yeah.
I can. We have a whole theme on adaptation, and we have another theme on development. So I help run the energy program within Tyndall. So there's a whole lot of research going on adaptation to climate change, resilience, and a lot of that focuses on the poorer people, a lot of work on sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and how institutions are resilient or not to climate change being added on top of the pile of challenges they already have to face. So I'd certainly say yes. And I think a look at our website will give you an idea of the breadth of that. And that includes, I think I'm right in saying, other people on my campus in Sussex working on adaptation in China itself as well. So that's the short answer to that. What will the effect be on the people in rural areas? I think Trevor's illustrated it very well, that the real driver of these emissions in China is the industry. And if government is successful in China in getting this under control, it actually creates headroom for this person that you mentioned, the archetypal farmer in Guangdong province, to buy the air conditioner and switch it on, because that shift would happen. And I think the important point is to say that these scenarios, whatever pathway the emissions follow, does include that flexibility if you can get those industrial emissions under control, for economic as well as environmental reasons.
Can I ask, I want to ask Trevor, can you say again, because Trevor said something that links to this that relates to what your question about human impact. When you talked about those 5 industries that you said was 42% of China's energy, and then you quickly said a number, and I wondered where you got it from, but that, I mean, these are the highly polluting industries. I mean, cement alone is probably the main, I'm looking at my cement guru here in front here to make sure she'll nod if I'm right or not. I mean, cement industry in China, it's like the major emitter of particulates, correct? And so, I mean, and major health impact for the people surrounding it. I mean, cement is being produced everywhere because every province wants their dozens and dozens of cement plants because there's money in it. But the environmental impact, the cost from these industries, can you tell us, what was that number again?
Sure. I mean, the World Bank and CEPA themselves put the estimate for the impact of air pollution at about $200 billion.
But that's just overall?
Overall air pollution.
Okay.
So there's a subsection of that. I mean, if you assume that these energy-intensive industries are 42% of energy demand, then they're going to be 42% of energy demand related SO2 and particulate matter. This is kind of monkey math I'm doing here.
No,
it's not
Chinese statistics. We get
not an exact figure, but there's a significant cost to these industries, and so the point is that given that cost, our industries that only employ 13 million people, right, and contribute that much to environmental degradation and that much to the country's energy bill, does that really make sense as something for a country that needs to create 15 million new jobs a year to do?
I mean, the number 2, that 750,000 people die a year of respiratory illnesses, from air pollution alone. Again, there's a lot of stats, and what's interesting, in the last year or so, we're starting to see the Ministry of Health actually starting to say things about pollution and health. And you get interesting stats about how much cancer rates have gone up. I don't know where they get these numbers from, but the fact that the Chinese government is becoming much more open on the environmental health linkage is significant. So I think that there is an awareness. And my last question related to hers, in China, who are the leading research centers that are looking at the questions of adaptation on climate?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, there are obviously people within the NDRC that are sort of running research, and there's all sorts of research projects going on, some in NGOs, but then, many of the leading universities now have programs at Tsinghua, at Renmin University. But because I come from the more mitigation energy side, I guess I know better the people who are coming from the energy direction as well as rather than adaptation. So. Okay.
Good.
Can I ask Joanna, where's the good adaptation research?
Yeah, I was going to look at it. Joanna, where's the good adaptation research? Do you want to give Joanna the mic? Can you hand the mic? I'm sorry. No? Chinese
Academy of Social Sciences.
Okay. Some other questions out there in audience land. How about right here, and then the gentleman up front. So, Kim, you can give it to him so then he can ask it shortly.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Herring. I'm from the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming. I work for Chairman Markey. And my question had to do somewhat with the U.S. policy side of things. Obviously, in both Lieberman, Warner, and Mr. Markey's bill, we consider this issue of the steel, cement, and paper industries. But if, as you said, these are things that China is moving away from anyway, and ignoring whether these things are actually WTO compliant, do you see any move or any possibility of things like the DVD player that you mentioned? I mean, that just seems so incredibly complex to try and understand where the CO2 emissions from a product like that come from, and trying to address, the trade differentials that may come from us losing that manufacturing ability, not of the core products like steel and paper and cement, but of the DVD player, of the car, of the other products that we're used to importing. And is there any sense of how we would go about, in the absence of an international agreement, how U.S. policy would go about addressing that aspect of imports if, in fact, addressing steel, cement, paper isn't going to be a big issue in 20 years if China moves away from these issues in the first place? So.
Right. So the measures that she's referring to, there's leading legislative proposals both in the Senate and the House that would impose a tariff at the border, where it's equivalent under a cap-and-trade system, on imports of carbon-intensive goods, so the 5 industries I put up there, from countries that had not taken comparable action to the U.S. in reducing emissions. And the intent with those measures is twofold. One is to protect U.S. industry and U.S. jobs and create it from migrating, prevent it from migrating overseas. And the second is that it will create, the hope is that it will create leverage. It'll be a stick that will help induce countries like China and India to take action they might not have otherwise. And when you look at the trade data, it's unclear that they would be effective on either of those counts. On the first count, it's very difficult to do an assessment of the carbon intensity of even steel and cement at the border. It's hard to open up a box of steel and cement and say there were 30 tons of steel emitted in making this steel beam. You can do it if you have the participation of every part of the production line in China, but you're not going to have that. So it's very difficult to do it at the border. And it doesn't create a great deal of leverage because, like I said, exports of those goods to the U.S. account for about 0.2% of Chinese GDP, right? So it's not a very big stick. And it's a stick that Beijing's already using to beat its own industry with anyway, trying to get exports to slow down. So then the question is, well, can you expand the list? You know, if you're trying to create a stick big enough to get China to play ball, can you expand the list? And the challenge there is twofold. It is already extraordinarily difficult to do an accurate assessment of the embedded carbon in steel. If you move downstream, it becomes impossible to do it anywhere near accurately. And the accuracy is important both in terms of creating the right environmental signals, but it's also important in terms of whether it's WTO legal, right? So if you look at a Barbie doll, for example, to be able to tell how much carbon is emitted in the production of a Barbie doll, you have to first start at where the crude oil was produced, what ethylene cracker was used to turn the crude oil into chemicals. You have to follow it all the way down the value chain. You have to look at where the paint comes from, you know. And as we saw with the Mattel situation, it's hard enough just finding out who glued the paint and the eyeballs on the Barbie doll. It's even harder to find out what factory the paint was produced at, and so on and so forth. These are global integrated industries. But even more importantly, if you were able to do that perfectly, of the $20 Barbie doll, a $50 per ton carbon cost would maybe change it from 1 penny to 2 pennies. Right, in the price of a Barbie doll. So it's not a big factor. It only matters. Energy is only an important cost for those 5 industries that are included in current legislation. So expanding the list doesn't really make the stick bigger, even if you could do it right, because when you get to those downstream goods, it's inconsequential in terms of cost.
No, I go along with that analysis. I think this kind of measure is going to have very little effect. The real driver of these exports to the US is low labor costs. And, you know, by fiddling around with the environmental content of those goods, particularly these labour-intensive goods, you're not going to have very much effect. And the other thing I would say as an alternative is why not, you know, have cap and trade, join the international system, and give American companies access to the low abatement cost opportunities in other countries, you know, particularly through the things like the CDM. I mean, that's, you know, if you look at it from the perspective of European industry, the progressive industries, that's what they want to do, because it's much cheaper to reduce a ton of carbon in China than it is in the US. And in the end, this is a global problem. So that would be my argument.
Okay, gentleman right here in the front.
I'm Graham Smith with the World Bank.
Check the bottom, make sure it's flicked on. So sorry.
Is that better? Still not.
Just give it a second.
Yes, that's better.
Okay. We got it.
Graham Smith, World Bank. Used to be full-time in Beijing with transport. Now I'm retired, but part-time, still working with the World Bank on, among other things, carbon footprint assessments. First of all, I wanted to say to Trevor, I fully take your point about the structural nature of the problem in the Chinese economy, because I recognize very similar phenomenon when it comes to transportation costs and logistics. A statistic that is handed out at many international conferences is that China logistics costs, transportation and other logistics costs, are 20% of the Chinese GDP, whereas in the US and Japan it's less than 10%. Therefore, the implication is that China is inefficient in its transportation systems. Not true. It's structural. It's that heavy industry and mining are very intensive in producing transportation and therefore consuming energy. And the countries they're being compared with are basically service economies, which, as you said, are none of the above. So it's really worth focusing on what is likely to accelerate the structural change within the Chinese economy. And I wonder whether there are effective instruments, policy instruments, that can accelerate that restructuring. Certainly one of the messages the World Bank has been pushing for a long time is get a fuel tax to internalize the environmental externalities of transportation and other parts of the economy. That has so far been resisted. What other solutions are there which could provide stronger fiscal incentives to this restructuring away from the transportation and energy-intensive industries? The World Bank has done at least a couple of CDM-type operations in China, but they were both to reduce production of other GHGs, other greenhouse gases than CO2, those which have much higher climate change impacts, methane and other abstruse chemicals that I can't remember the term for. I'm wondering whether in the analysis that you've both been giving us, you've been focusing solely on CO2, or whether you've also taken into account other greenhouse gases which are more damaging in terms of climate change impact.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll take the first and give you the second. On the basket of tools that can be used to what's called rebalance Chinese growth, right? So away from investment, particularly in energy-intensive industry, away from net exports towards more consumption and services. The most effective policy levers are not going to be energy policy levers. They're going to be macro policy levers and financial policy levers. What gave rise to that energy-intensive industry in the first place was not low energy prices. It was low capital costs. Low cost of land. It takes 9 months to build an aluminum smelter in China. It takes 4 years in Europe, and your construction costs are considerably lower. Energy prices in China are actually fairly high by developing country standards and even by some developed country standards. People would argue that they're not high enough, and in the past few months with global commodity prices going up quite a bit, there's become a gap. But for things like electricity for industry, the per kilowatt hour rate in China is considerably higher than a lot of parts of the U.S. So much so, in fact, that you now have $10 billion of new steel investment taking place in the U.S. While steel mills are getting shut in China. Now, a lot of that's the currency. We're the new developing country. We have a cheap currency and relatively cheap labor costs compared to those expensive Europeans. Logistics costs are important too in the global sense, right? And when with oil prices where they are, seaborne transport can add 10, 15% to a lot of manufactured goods, much more to heavy industrial goods. There's a number of measures that Beijing's already trying to take. They are changing the cost of capital to energy-intensive industry. They're reforming land prices. I would argue all of that is going too slow. There's more that they need to do. I think a lot of the change will happen despite an absence of government policy, and it's just going to be a change in the operating economics of these industries like we've talked about. Over the past 5 years, the global trend was energy-intensive industries moving towards demand centers. So cement and steel moving towards China and India because that's where the demand was, right? Despite relatively high energy costs, despite comparatively poor mineral endowments. In a high-cost, commodity cost environment, what's happening is those industries are moving towards the resource base. It becomes much more important to be sitting on the iron ore or sitting on the bauxite or having cheap natural gas or cheap electricity. So you have Chinese steel mills investing in steel production in Brazil with CVRD to sell to the Chinese market. You have a Chinese aluminum company investing in Saudi Arabia with so they can take advantage of Saudi bauxite and Saudi natural gas. I think that change in the operating economics is going to help rebalance economic growth in China faster than any government policy.
On your second question, we didn't look at other greenhouse gases. I mean, in China, the big one is CO2. Even though there's these very well publicised HFC destruction projects under the CDM, HFCs being the greenhouse gas you were thinking of. But actually, the biggest issue is CO2. And I think as long as you're using the budget for CO2 and you're doing CO2 under that, that's fine. You could extend it to other gases, and certainly if you were doing analysis of some other countries, that would be more important. But we've decided to. I mean, it's a big enough issue, to be honest, and the thing to analyse. We've probably bitten off more than we can chew anyway. So if we added another greenhouse gases, we'd be buried. So I think we've done. It's a pragmatic thing. Yeah.
Okay, Claire, right here.
Okay.
Thank you both very much for speaking today. My name is Claire Sorowski, and I'm a graduate student at Princeton University working with environmental defense this summer. And I have a question for both of you. For Jim, you talked about these two different budget scenarios, the 70 gigatons and the 110 gigatons of carbon. What would that mean in terms of commitments for China over the next 30, 40 years? And then for Trevor, I feel like you've talked a lot about this already, but could you please just more explicitly talk about the key sectors that or key industries that you think China should focus on, and more explicitly talk about the competitive concerns that those would alleviate? Thank you.
On your question, I mean, the good thing about pointing out that it's cumulative and there's a budget over time is it does give China, or indeed any other country, a lot of flexibility over how it chooses to take on commitments. So I expect realistically, in the short to medium term, under the post-2012 deal, China will resist, and quite rightly, any kind of hard and fast cap of the kind that, say, the UK has under Kyoto, because I don't think it's appropriate. But you may find some commitments that are softer under certain policies or being countered, or energy intensity targets of the kind the government has already, which is, for example, the one that says by 2020 they will quadruple GDP whilst only doubling energy demand, for example. And you can see from our pathways, you could start off on that pathway and then perhaps at an appropriate time convert that into something harder when there is evidence actually that the developed countries have actually set caps and lived within them and shown that it can be done. And I think, to me, that's the acid test. So if, in 5 years' time, Congress over here has passed a cap-and-trade resolution, it's been shown to work, the EU emissions trading scheme actually has some proper ambitious caps rather than the rather flabby ones we have at the moment, and actually it's been seen to work too, then I think we're in a better moral position as developed countries to start saying, well, China and India, you ought to join and do the same thing. And for them, they can say, oh, actually, these guys have actually started doing it, so they're putting their money where their mouth is. So it's very much about politics. But the good thing about the approach we've taken is there is flexibility for that politics to take place.
So the industries for which energy costs matter, and thus there's concerns in the U.S. about what the impact of climate policy would be, are iron and steel, aluminum, copper, cement, glass, basic chemicals, not all chemicals, but basic chemicals, the ones for which energy costs are significant, like petrochemicals, paper and pulp. I don't know if I said that already. That pretty much gets us there. And those industries will all be affected very differently under climate policy. Some have a carbon footprint that's directly inside the fence of their plant. Others, it comes indirectly in the form of the electricity that they buy. That's the case for aluminum, right? Mm-hmm. Aluminum doesn't have a lot of direct emissions, but it buys a lot of electricity, and that's where the emissions come from. China is focusing most squarely on the iron and steel sector and on the cement industry, because that's the lion's share of energy-intensive industrial emissions in China, and it's where most of the low-hanging fruit in terms of efficiency lies. You have about 7,000 steel companies in China. That's up from 3,000 just 5 years ago. And while the largest, like the Bao Steels, are global players, global scale, Bao Steel itself is only 5 or 6% of the market. And you go down and they're much smaller firms. So there's a desire to consolidate that industry, both to slow the growth in production, but also to improve average efficiency. And that's actually pretty good news in terms of reaching an agreement internationally on standards for those industries, because you have the best-in-class firms in China, like the Bao Steels and the Wuhan Steels, that are trying to buy steel mills in the neighboring province. That's difficult to do because of local protectionism, and that's one of the things that keeps the industry fragmented, right? So an agreement that would help require consolidation in the industry would be supported by the most politically powerful firms in China, and would also have pretty significant environmental and energy benefits, as well as alleviating competitiveness concerns in the U.S. In the interim, trying to sell faith that China is going to take action to Congress is not enough, right? The good news is that those 5 industries I talked about combined account for about 6% of U.S. emissions. So there is plenty of room in the design of domestic policy to take care of those competitiveness concerns, either through allocation or output-based rebating measures in the interim until we reach international agreement.
Okay, another question right here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. So Kim, you can hand it to her there in a minute. I'll get to her. Okay, go ahead.
I am Irene Farkas Khan. I'm retired now, but I'm formerly with the University of Chicago and later with Arthur L. Khan and Associates, which was energy, environmental, and management international energy, environmental, and management consulting group. And my question is, clearly, apparently nowadays, the manufacturing is more concerned about proper environmental concerns. However, is there any effort to try to improve all those plants that for several decades were not particularly concerned about the environment as compared to the United States, for instance?
You're talking about in China?
Yes. Yes.
The good news about growing 10% a year is that you can turn over the capital stock pretty quickly, right? So you take iron and steel, for example. There are a significant amount of plants that are still small and inefficient, but their relative share gets smaller and smaller each year because you're investing a lot in creating new. Unlike in the U.S., for example, the U.S. chemical industry is some of the least efficient at the basic chemical level in the world because we built the stuff in the 70s, and there hasn't been any demand growth really, so we haven't replaced it. And it becomes very expensive to go back and retrofit. So in China, you have the ability to try out new things in terms of industrial energy efficiency that you can't elsewhere in the world because you're adding capacity, right? It's easier to build it in the new plant than go back and retrofit the old plant.
Okay. Right there, Monty and Jay in the back there in the gray.
Hi, this is just a question about how China can respond to some of these international pressures. One reason the industry is fragmented is each district in China wants to have its own economic base. They want to. People rise in the government by having a good economic base, economic growth. And what are the things China can do as a part of scientific development to change that? Get rid of the local inefficient factories and so on, and put in something else there which can replace them.
And you have your slogan down very well. Scientific development. Good.
You want to start?
Sure. I think it's very difficult, actually, because, ever since I started working on China about 10 years ago, there have been annual speeches by people in Beijing saying we want to rationalize industry and close down the small factories, and whether it's in steel or chemicals